You might ask the question, how can it be that we actually are consuming more than nature can provide? And the answer is that this measure includes the so-called sinks, how we get rid of our waste products. And one of the major waste products is carbon dioxide, coming primarily from burning of fossil fuels. And where does that carbon dioxide go? Well, a lot of it gets absorbed in the oceans. And when you absorb carbon dioxide in the oceans, it becomes more acidic. And this is what has been happening for a long time. And many, many marine biologists are warning us now that this is having a dramatic effect on marine life. It's even a very small change in acidity can affect many marine plants, animals, fish, and so on. So this is really a dangerous situation. And of course, the rest of the CO2, as we're all aware of by now, is heating up the atmosphere due to the greenhouse effect. And so as time goes on, we're not only destroying our oceans and the marine life there, we're increasing the temperature in the atmosphere and potentially threatening our very survival. So that's what's happened on the environment issue. Third area, economics. Once again, we see a very dramatic shifting occurring around 1980. This time, the upper curve is showing the gross domestic product in the United States for this period of roughly 50 years, from 1950 to about 2002. So we had a pretty steady increase in growth. But one of the things we have to realize about gross domestic product is that it is a measure of total activity. It does not in any way distinguish between positive and negative activities. So if we have more highway accidents, the GNP goes up. If we have more pollution to cleanups, like we had in Fukushima and we had in the Mexican Gulf with BP, cleaning up pollution increases the GNP. So what some people have done, the ecological economists, have said, okay, let's deduct the negatives from the positives and see what's left. Because that is a measure then, you might say, of our actual well-being. I mean, what are we getting out of all this activity? And this is what the lower curve is showing. This is called a genuine progress indicator. This is for the United States. Notice how it flattens out around 1978 or 1980. And since then, it's been pretty flat and actually declining slightly. And this is the background for a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere saying, well, we're no better off than our parents. In fact, we're probably worse off in many ways. We may have some increase in income, but the actual quality of our life has been deteriorating. So here we have three different areas where we can see there's been deterioration over the last 30 years. So let's see, what is the common thread in all this? And I'm saying that basically the common thread which can start explaining this has to do with our worldview. How do we look at the world? This is something which is normally almost taken for granted, and it's something that changes very slowly over time. And the current worldview, which is dominated for probably about 400 years, is based on the idea that man is separate from nature. Okay, this was one of Descartes' ideas, among others. And in this way of looking at the world, resources, or the nature rather, is looked upon as resources to be exploited. So it's an exploitative paradigm, you might say. And that is one of the reasons why we've had such a tremendous increase in science during this period, because this is a very powerful tool in developing science. The so-called reductionist approach. We take these very complex systems like nature and so forth, and break it down into small parts and analyze the individual parts. And we develop so-called linear models. But the world is not linear. The world, 95% of all processes happening around us in the world are non-linear. And yet the models that we operate with in science are almost entirely linear. We have because they're much easier to work with, of course, that's why. And so this worldview has led to an economic system which is exploitative also, not only of the environment, but also of the weaker parts of society. So we're not only exploiting the environment, we're exploiting each other. And this is where I come back to the question, what happened around 1980? And what happened was that Ronald Reagan got into power in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And both of those people adopted the idea that became known as neoliberal economics, that by giving maximum freedom to the private sector, to corporations to do what they please, without deregulation, free flow of goods across borders, free flow of capital, privatization of public utilities. The philosophy was that this would benefit everyone by giving by greatest possible freedom to the corporate sector. But we know now what the results were after 30 years. In fact, these were predicted. One of the best historical economists is Karl Polanyi, who wrote his book, The Great Transformation, back in 1944. And in that book, he said that if we ever give total power to the corporate sector to do as they please, they will destroy not only man, but his environment. And this is what we've been doing for 30 years. It's an experiment, an unprecedented experiment. And this is the result: deterioration in the social, ecological, and economic areas. The philosophy here is, as I write here, profits trump investment. In other words, economics is kind of a top line for all our decisions. And the economic system is somewhere down below. It's just resources to be exploited. Now, if that wasn't enough, I'm just going to throw in another problem which is facing us, so-called peak oil. This is unrelated to the neoliberalism as such, but it's important to realize that the use of oil, if you look at it over geological time, will be seen as our successors several generations ahead, probably as a relatively short-lived period. They'll probably call this the oil age of about 200 years, from 1850 roughly to 2050. And you notice how right now we're at the very top of this, the very peak. We don't know exactly when the peak is going to occur. The experts have different opinions about this, but they're pretty much in agreement that it's going to happen. And when we hit that peak and go down into decline, what's going to happen? Well, the oil isn't going to disappear, but there won't be enough of it. For the first time ever, we're going to have an excess of demand over supply. Until now, there's always been an excess of supply over demand. And once demand exceeds supply, not least due to the growth rates in China and India, prices of oil are going to go through the roof because there won't be enough to go around. There'll still be oil for maybe another 50 years at the rate we're using it, but we're going to have an economic crisis, much worse than anything we've seen, much, much worse than the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. Much, much worse than what's happening in Europe today because of the Eurozone. So this is what's ahead of us, and I mention it because if we want to be realists, we have to take that into account. By the way, this is an interesting question. Sometimes people ask me, they say, aren't you an idealist? I say, no. The idealists are the people who think that growth can go on forever. They're utopians. It's an impossible idea. I'm trying to be a realist and say, what's actually happening in the world and what can we do about it? Try to convince some politician about that. Lots of luck. There's both good news and bad news. The good news is that a shift in this worldview or paradigm seems to be occurring, and has been over a period of, maybe 50 or 80 years gradually. In fact, already in the 1920s, with the emergence of the Heisenberg principle and research in nuclear physics, it became very clear that the old worldview was wrong. In fact, it's been since then proven experimentally that everything is connected across the entire universe, in fact, not just across this one planet. That is one of the truths which has been shown experimentally in quantum physics. We're all connected in ways that we don't understand. And so this new shift of paradigm is moving us towards the idea that we are all part of nature. Everything is connected. We can't separate ourselves from nature or from each other. And this is what the new paradigm is telling us, is that the Earth is as James Lovelock also pointed out, as a self-regulating system. Some people would even call it a living system, although Lovelock would not use those words exactly. That is what the emerging paradigm is telling us. And this has very serious consequences, because it's no longer an exploitative paradigm. It's more of a cooperative paradigm, where we consider the entire globe, the entire planet Earth, as a single family. and if part of the family is starving in Africa, it's like you have a gangrene in your foot, you know. Eventually it's going to spread to the rest of the body. And so we have to start thinking about all these parts of the world, not as places that we can exploit, as the neoliberal system does, but part of an extended family. But then comes the bad news. When we start talking about reforms, how are we going to make changes? We're faced with one very, very serious problem, which is particularly an American problem. This word, corporocracy, which is on the chart here, is a term which was suggested by John Perkins, who wrote a book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. How many of you read that book? It's a good book. I really recommend it. What he does is he exposes the whole philosophy behind the World Bank's activities, where he was actually a consultant working for the World Bank in developing countries, and showed that in fact the real agenda was simply to create debt in order to keep them in place so that they could continue supplying cheap raw materials and be available for votes in the UN when necessary, and for new military bases and so forth. So a corporatocracy in his world is basically the large American corporations and their wealthy shareholders. And the top 1% or so of wealth holders in the United States, they control basically all of the major corporations. And so what's been happening over the last 30 years in particular, as this corporatocracy and the wealthy people, as we saw, have been taking a larger and larger slice of the total income for themselves, and they've been using it to get political power. That's really what's been happening. And so now they've now taken control of the media. All the major television networks are now owned by the corporations. They've taken control of the financial sector, as we saw. And what's most alarming is that they've taken control of the political system. Through campaign finance laws recently, the Supreme Court made a judgment which backed up the fact that in America, corporations are seen as having so-called personhood. So they have the same rights as persons. What does that mean? It means they have the right of free speech. Okay, and so the Supreme Court says that means that they have the right, just like any individual, to support political candidates with any amounts of money they want. This is really a basic attack on democracy. Even President Obama made that statement on a radio program shortly after. He said this is a major attack on our democracy. But what it means is that the corporatocracy, the super wealthy, are able to take over the political system because they can decide what candidates get elected and who doesn't get re-elected in particular. So the reason I mention this is because a lot of the activities done by NGOs around the world, including the ones I've been supporting, are all pretty much based on one basic premise, and that is that if we just explain the problems enough and show all what's happening, then surely the politicians will realize that and will take some action. But it hasn't been happening that way. Why? Why aren't the politicians reacting? I mean, these warnings have been put out now for, at least back to the 60s and early 70s with the limits to growth and many other studies. The Union of Concerned Scientists made a strong statement in 1992 saying, these are most Nobel Prize winners and others saying to the politicians, we have to do something. We're on a suicidal course globally. No action. I was in Rio here in June. Another big disappointment. No commitments whatsoever from governments. In fact, the one most obvious proposal coming from the NGOs was, couldn't we at the least quit giving subsidies to the burning of fossil fuels? You know how much money is being spent annually on subsidies to fossil fuels? Hold your breath. $775 billion every year. That's more than 10 times all the foreign aid. The government said, no, we can't do that. I mean, it might affect growth, right? We don't want that to happen. So this is what we're up against. And so that's why it's important to realize that if we're going to make reforms, we're going to have to develop different strategies. We cannot confront this structure directly. It's too powerful. And while this is an American phenomenon, I'm not claiming that other countries have a corporatocracy, anything like the USA. I mean, here in Europe, certainly the corporations have a lot of influence, but nothing like controlling the political system. By the way, you know, one of the leading experts on democracy is David Held, professor at the London Business School. And his writings, he makes a point which a lot of people I don't think quite realize, and that is that the democratic system itself has a flaw in the sense that it gives a privileged position to the corporate sector. You know, we think one man, one vote, and that's what democracy is. But the reality is that these capital concentrations that we have in the corporate sector means that they can get the ear of the politicians, they can get the influence, they can put pressure on for tax breaks. And we know all the stories how that works in practice. And they're the ones that the politicians call in when they want to consider new legislation. So they haven't, and this has gone to an extreme in the US, an extreme that is unprecedented. So it's what I call the structural problem we're facing, if we want to talk about reforms. This is, you know, in my opinion, pretty much the way the world order works today. At the very top, we have the American corporatocracy, which controls the US Congress and hence the US administration. And through these international organizations, in particular the WTO, World Trade Organization, IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, this influence is projected over the entire globe. Nothing happens in these three organizations against the will of the United States, even though the Americans don't have formal majorities. In practice, because of their relationships with their allies and their control over many so-called client states, developing countries who are obligated to them in one way or another, they have effective control. And what has happened with these three organizations over the last couple of generations is also a kind of a mutation. You know, the WTO in particular is a major barrier to sustainability. Let me give you just a couple of examples of why. Let's suppose you're a country, you're the president or the prime minister of a country that would like to take the lead in terms of reform. Let's put sustainability at the top line. Let's introduce ecological economics. Let's put demands upon our domestic corporations to have higher standards, higher environmental standards. What happens? Well, the major corporations say to the politicians, well, if you do that, we won't be able to compete with our foreign competitors. We may even have to leave. That's exactly what many corporations have threatened their politicians when they come up with these ideas. And so you might ask, well, why don't the politicians just put a tariff on the foreign products that are produced with lower environmental standards? Can't do that. WTO does not allow that. No, you have to respect the fact that foreign corporations have just as much right as your local citizens. Another example, developing countries are told, you mustn't give any benefit to any domestic corporation that you do not give to a foreign corporation. Okay? Sounds reasonable, maybe, for some people. But you know what? That is a guarantee that those developing countries will not develop. They will remain suppliers of cheap raw materials and cheap labor. Why? Every single country which is ever industrialized, and that's starting with Great Britain, later the USA, then in Japan, now it's China, every single one has only become industrialized by protectionism, by protecting its industries until they become competitive. And so what we're basically saying here to the developing countries is, you may not do what we did. Your role in this world is to supply us with cheap raw materials and let them compete with each other. Who can provide the cheapest wheat, the cheapest minerals of all different kinds? That's the role that they've been given in this system. Take the IMF. The IMF has also mutated over the last 30, 40 years. Until the neoliberals came into power, the idea of the IMF, as suggested by Keynes originally back in 1945, was that it was to provide liquidity to countries who got into difficulties, temporary difficulties in terms of trade, so they could borrow money, have an expansionist economy so they could start to grow again, and then pay back the money. And what the IMF did under the neoliberals was turn that upside down. And now they said, no, you're not to be expansionist, you're to be contractionist. And so the conditions they began to make on countries if they wanted loans was to contract the economy, where the very first priority was to repay the IMF and its Western banks. That was the first priority. And if that meant cutting out subsidies to local schools, reducing wages, putting pressure on corporations to drop any kinds of environmental standards and so forth. Privatize. They sell off your assets to the Western banks at great rates. This was what the IMF introduced, so-called structural adjustment, a euphemism for basically contracting the economy, increasing their foreign trade results so that they can repay the banks. That was never envisioned by Keynes. In fact, Joseph Stiglitz, who was the former chief economist at the World Bank, made the statement once that he said, Keynes would turn over in his grave if he saw what had been done to his baby. Then we have the World Bank, and as I mentioned before, John Perkins wrote this fantastic book about the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Well, he points out that the original role of the World Bank, as envisaged back in the Bretton Woods period after the Second World War, was that they were to eradicate poverty and do this by providing cheap loans to developing countries, which they would raise on international markets. Actually, there wasn't much use for the loans for a long time, because most countries actually had savings rates that were quite adequate. And so what they began to do is instead of that, to start making deals with a lot of the developing countries, to give them loans, create debt, basically, that they didn't really need, and do it in conjunction with corrupt leaders, political leaders, and their cronies, and the leading business people in the country. And so what we had was this tremendous debt being put on the developing countries, which was not helping the poor at all. I mean, most of it was going to the elite in the developing countries for arms purchases and for supporting their cronies and building prestige projects. And very, very little of it ever got to the original intention, which was to alleviate poverty. But what it did have was the effect of capturing these developing countries as client states of the neoliberal system. So now, when you're in deep debt, you don't have a lot of freedom left. So you're forced to comply with the wishes of the United States if you want to get on. So noted at the very bottom of my system here, we have the 7 billion world citizens. So they have very little influence as to what's happening. This is a system which we have to deal with. And I'll start talking about how we deal with this and discuss some possible solutions which take account of the way I framed the problems. Okay? Thank you.